There is a lot of power in a name, and that's something that's been a core theme of the Duel Monsters anime, where only through learning Atem's true name was Zorc defeated. And surprisingly enough, this idea has actually translated pretty well to the game's mechanics, because just having the right name or being part of a specific archetype, a card can go from painfully mediocre to downright busted. As a result, there are a lot of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That go out of their way to alter names with an effect or condition, either to make them work better within a specific set of cards, or purely for flavor. And in the modern era, we see quite a few successful examples of cards that aren't treated as their original name. But the initial implementation of this was entirely flawed, and trying to deck build with these cards in mind was always a bit of a hassle, which is why today we're going to be examining the way cards change their name, how that can alter how they're used, and how more modern card designs manage to save this mechanic from its illegible origins. Name-altering cards do exactly what you'd expect. They change their name in some way to be different to the name that's actually printed on the card, with the most well-known examples of this in the game being the cards that treat themselves as Umi. But even amongst these cards, the way this name change will occur can often be quite different. Some cards, for instance, will only change their name while in a specific location, which we can see with the likes of Sea Stealth 2, which only is treated as Umi while on the field or in the graveyard, while others, such as the Cavalcade of Ocean-themed field spells, are always treated as a different name, no matter the situation. Likewise, some cards will only change a part of their name so that they can be aligned with a certain archetype, while others will change their name entirely to become a new card. The concept behind this idea is really smart because having an extra name, or changing a card's name, can give a card a lot of extra depth both in terms of lore and game mechanics. Flavor-wise, a card altering its name in some way can have huge implications to the stories that they're involved in. Take the Albaz storyline for example. There are 3 contexts in which a card changes its name to Fallen of Albaz, and each time it signals something different. In the case of Albion the Shrouded Dragon, it's done to showcase that despite his dragonic form, Albion is still the same Fallen of Albaz that we know and love, and that he has more control over this form than he might have with his other fusions. Likewise, Albaz the Ashen is the reverse of this. After being depowered by a Luber, Albaz is still ready to fight with everything he has, even in an entirely hopeless situation. However, the Bestial Luber's name is also treated as Fallen of Albaz because he's managed to steal Albaz's powers. This kind of flavor might seem somewhat superficial and overall unimportant when it comes to the actual game, but having different avenues to convey ideas and themes throughout the mechanics of the game without having to use flavor text is one of Yu-Gi-Oh's biggest strengths, and makes the game feel like less just a game and more like an enriched world of people and interactions. But it's definitely not just in Yu-Gi-Oh storytelling where name changes are important, as an altered card name can have huge ramifications and ripple effects on a duel-to-duel basis, or it can allow for a card that otherwise would struggle to synergize with a particular strategy to suddenly become a linchpin of a deck's design. And even the particular way that a card name is changed can have a huge impact on how strong certain cards are. Visa Samsara displays this point perfectly. It's a monster with 2 solid enough effects that allow for it to work as a decent extender by shuffling back a Visa Starfrost, and comes with some added utility in being able to be either a tuner or non-tuner depending on what you need. But that's not all Samsara can do. As well in the field or the graveyard, it will change its name to Visa Starfrost. This is a really important detail, as by using Samsara's extension or just by normal summoning it, you can immediately commit a Visa Starfrost on the field, which you can then use to gain access to the Scareclaw half of your strategy. And this gets even better because Samsara is also Visa's in the grave, which allows you to banish it for the summon of Vicious Astrolaud later in the turn for even more extension. This doesn't even scratch the surface of Samsara's strengths, and you will get all of this while still having the opportunity to play it alongside the original Visas, meaning that you don't have to sacrifice deck building principles to include both in the deck at the same time, due to Samsara's name changing ability being an effect that only happens sometimes and not a condition that's always active. So, with their impact on both gameplay and story being unequivocal and undeniable, how are cards that change their name failed cards? Well, the simple answer is that they aren't failed cards at all. In fact, it's pretty common to see name-altering effects, both within the modern era and sprinkled throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Because the utility of altering a card's name, as well as the different ways a name can be changed, actually affords a lot of breathing room for card designers that might want to give an older deck built around specific cards a fresh coat of paint with a new powerhouse for them to build around. Or by having cards alter their name in only specific locations, you can encourage newer tools with a similar purpose to their original alternative, while still having them work side by side together in cases where the original might have an upper hand against its retrade. Even something as mundane as allowing a card to be part of an archetype that it otherwise wouldn't be a part of for one reason or another can change the landscape of how that strategy is played in the wider game. And so, because of how useful name changers have the potential to be, it's entirely unfair to say the mechanic is a failure. In fact, it might be one of the most successful mechanics we've ever discussed on this particular series. Although, for however true that might be, there was a point in the game's history where the nuanced ways a card could have a new name, as well as the effect that might have on the strategy, weren't as explored as it could have been, and while its introduction to the game was a net positive, there have been a couple of bumps along the way. Interestingly enough, the earliest known way card names are altered wasn't done with an effect or condition. In fact, it was pretty difficult to realize these cards were different at all. You see, back in 2003, Upper Deck Entertainment hit a problem with the release of Dark Crisis, a set which contained a whole host of new archefiend cards that were set to coalesce these demonic cards around a chess-themed strategy, with some of the more notable pieces focusing on buffing and protecting other archefiends. This was far from a competitive viable strategy, but it was one that brought together the small collection of archefiends that had been released over the years into a deck to call home. However, a lot of the cards that were supposed to work with the archetype didn't actually have archefiend in their name. You see, over in the OCG, this collection of cards isn't known as archefiends at all. They're known as Duel Monsters for the grotesque and fiend-like forms, but no matter how fitting this term might have been for these evil appearing monsters, there was no way the name would slide in the TCG. Especially back in the early 2000s, where a lot of people genuinely believed that Yu-Gi-Oh was a demonic game due to its emphasis on dark imagery, rituals, and mysticism. As a result, the game's most obvious references to these sensitive topics were often heavily censored and altered to appease Western audiences, and a lot of this censorship you can still see to this day, as cards with potentially religious or satanic imagery still being altered to this day to avoid any potential connotations. And so the translators over at Konami and Upper Deck did what they could to properly localize any card with Daemon in its name to sound a lot more palatable. Daemon's Axe was changed to the more neutral Axe of Despair. Daemon Tamer now only tamed shadows. And of course, the Summoned Daemon had greater emphasis placed on its bone-white highlights and skeletal appearance so that he would become Summoned Skull. But you might have noticed a small issue with these names. Despite how cool they all might sound, they don't fall under a unified naming scheme, which meant that with the release of the Chess Daemons officially codifying the archetype, a creative solution had to be found so the game in the TCG reflected its OCG counterpart. And so, this small collection of cards actually received their own special ruling that made it so that these cards were all considered archefiend monsters. Now, for what it's worth, this solution had its upsides. What was considered an archefiend card was clearly stated on Upper Deck's website and could be used as a reference for any kind of confusion. Although it was still a primitive way of implementing this condition, and in most cases, there was nothing about these cards that would signal that they had any relation to the chess series. Of course, the likes of Summoned Skull clearly inspire their appearance, but monsters like Beast of Talar and Lesser Fiend look like they belong to a whole different species of devil. So unless you knew to check, how would you even know that these cards could be featured as part of the same deck? And that's where we can call the alteration of the card's name a failure. One of the most important things about any card game is the ability of the cards to communicate information to the people playing them. Take Magic the Gathering. There are a cavalcade of keywords in the game that no new player is going to be able to instantly glean after a single match. But the fact that the keyword is on the card at least prompts them to be curious and investigate further. In the case of Yu-Gi-Oh's Archefiends, however, there was nothing. No special symbol, no extra ability to mark them as Archefiends, not even a single line of text featured on reprints from this era. This left the main ways you'd find out about the Archefiends being Upper Deck's website and word of mouth. But with the internet not being as widespread back then as it is today, as well as social media still being in its infancy, this kind of information would spread a lot slower than it would today. Although you shouldn't get it twisted, the chess Archefiends never even scratched the surface of competitive viability. Furthermore, their place in the meta was never going to be based around whether or not the other Archefiends could be played well with the strategy, since all of them aren't amazing. So placing the blame of Archefiend's lack of success onto these cards doesn't make much sense. What it does show, however, is a different kind of failure from what we usually discuss, because the way this name change was implemented into the game was a failure of design to properly communicate what these cards were. Archefiend wasn't the only strategy to suffer from some growing pains when it came to its name being altered, as yet another of Yu-Gi-Oh's iconic archetypes suffered alongside it, but for different reasons, that being the Harpy Lady. This strategy, as well as the way it was presented to us in the anime, was quite unique, as it focuses almost entirely on making the relatively underpowered Harpy Lady into a genuine threat by reuniting her with her sisters, and buffing their stats even further with a series of equips that made them even more deadly. This was really neat because almost every card associated with the deck revolved entirely around Harpy Lady and Harpy Lady's sisters, which gave the strategy a more unique flair when you got to pull out cards that only Harpy Lady could use. But for as cool as this was, it also came with some issues. Because the way all these cards were worded meant that they weren't future-proofed for any kind of upcoming support. As they didn't work with Harpy Lady monsters, they only worked with cards that were specifically named Harpy Lady. Even Harpy Lady's sister sometimes doesn't synergize with the likes of Harpy's pet dragon, and couldn't be used to fulfill the conditions of Elegant Egotist. So, if you want to create more monsters for the Harpy strategy while having them synergize with the deck's most foundational cards, you have to solve this little conundrum. And there's a pretty obvious answer sitting right in front of you. Why not just have these new monsters always be treated as Harpy Lady? And that's exactly what they did with the new wave of support that was released for the deck, with Harpy Lady 1, 2, and 3, as well as Cyber Harpy Lady, all releasing with a condition in their card text that made it so that they were always treated as Harpy Lady, which sounds like the perfect solution as these newer monsters could now work with the deck's original foundation. However, this line of text caused another huge problem. A card that was always treated as Harpy Lady was always treated as Harpy Lady, both within a duel and for the purposes of deck building. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can only ever include a maximum of 3 copies of a card within a deck. This meant that even though Harpy Lady 1, 2, and 3, and Cyber Harpy Lady were all unique in terms of their stats and effects, they all share the same name, limiting you to only being able to play 3 of these cards, no matter how you mix and match them, forcing you to exclude at least 2 Harpy Ladies from your deck at any given time. In fact, when Harpy Lady was seen competitive play back in 2013 and 14, you couldn't even spread yourself that thin, and would instead just play multiple copies of whatever you deemed the best Harpy Lady monster to be, which in most cases meant you were either on a playset of Harpy Lady 1 due to its ability to buff your entire field, Cyber Harpy Lady because of its high attack stat, or a mix of both, with Harpy Ladies 2 and 3 alongside the original usually collecting dust. And it's always a shame to see the original boss monster of an archetype shelved for a straight upgrade. Now, the Harpies are just one of the earliest examples of this, and they are far from the most extreme or egregious case of rough naming conditions, because that title would actually end up going to the next series of Neo-Spacian monsters. This small and incomplete series of Neo-Spacian fusions were essentially light upgrades of their original forms, with Marine Dolphin having the same effect as Aqua Dolphin of destroying a monster in your opponent's hand with less attack than a monster you control at the cost of a discard, but removing the risk of a 500 burn if you can't find one. While Twinkle Moss is virtually the same card as Glow Moss, but causes you to draw a card whenever it's involved with an attack rather than your opponent. These aren't meta-warping cards by any means, but they are cute enough ideas. However, the only way to summon these monsters is with the spell card Next, which sends a Neo-Spacian from your field to the graveyard to bring out a monster with the same name from your extra deck. And so, every monster summoned by Next needs to have the same name as their weaker form, which is given to them by their condition. This is already a lot of hoops to jump through, but gets even more ridiculous because, even though they're technically a part of 2 different decks, the main and the extra, the 3-card restriction to name cards still applies. This means that if you want the privilege of being able to play Neo-Spacian Marine Dolphin in any capacity, you have to cut down on the only monster in your deck that you can use to summon it, counterintuitively making the card far less consistent and harder to summon. Thankfully, after these rough first attempts, name changers got figured out quite quickly, with cards like Proto-Cyber Dragon, Elemental Hero Neos Alias, and Dupe Frog all being able to change their name while still letting you run the cards that you're copying, as instead of a condition, these cards all have an effect that applies at some point during gameplay and are treated as their original name for the purposes of deck building, which can make them a seamless addition to their associated deck without any real issues. But even though name changers had been figured out quite early, it by no means meant that they were initially a game-changing feature. Take Neos Alias for example. It's an iconic card for Heroes' competitive history, as its existence opened up a new way of playing the strategy. But this was never because Alias had the potential to change its name. Make no mistake, if you needed a way to commit an Elemental Hero Neos to the field to gain access to the Neo-Spacian fusions, then Neos Alias was an option. But the actual power of the card was contained in it being a light hero monster with high attack that just so happened to be a Gemini monster. This made Neo Alias the perfect storm of stats. Being an Elemental Hero card meant that it had a whole host of powerful support that it could be used to pair with. So you could add it to your hand with Stratos, fuse it away with Miracle Fusion, or add it back from the grave with Hero Blast. Likewise, its ability also opened up the chance to play a few strong Gemini support cards, including Gemini Spark, a removal tool that, for the cost of tributing away a Gemini monster, will let you destroy a card in the field and draw a free card, which granted you an insane amount of tempo. Doubly so when done in response to an opponent's removal effect. And combine all of this with its impressive 1900 attack and light attribute, which made it great fusion materials for the likes of the Shining, it's no wonder that Neos Alias was a keystone card for Hero Beat. But none of this utility had anything to do with Alias's name, and trying to force its effect to be useful in any capacity is really awkward, as you'd not only have to jump through the hoops of bringing it to the field, then normal summon it to actually use its effect, but you'd also have to bring out a Neo-Spacian alongside it for Alias's name change to truly be relevant, which is a lot to shoot for even in the modern era. Let alone back when Alias was in its prime, where the potential payoff for its name changers were far from worth it. Now, being entirely fair, some of Neo Alias's weaknesses as a name changer is tied to the fact that it's also a Gemini, but that doesn't change the fact that the payoff for the effect was mild at best, as each of the Neo-focused fusions that were released back then had payoffs that didn't exactly match the trouble it took to summon them, especially when they're forced to shuffle themselves back at the end of the turn too. And this struggle is not unique to Alias either, as a lot of the other early name-altering cards from back in the day often weren't worth playing either, at least not because of their ability to change their name. Proto-Cyber Dragon is a great showcase of this due to how simple its effect is. It doesn't have any harsh restrictions or downsides holding it back, and it has a clear and intentional goal for how its name change can be helpful, since it can give you an easy way to bring out a Cyber Dragon so that you can better access the strategy's best fusions. This sounds awesome in theory, but the more you think about it, the worse the idea gets. You see, Proto-Cyber Dragon actually doesn't do much except make finding Cyber Dragon a little bit easier, but you still have to find a way to a fusion spell as well as a secondary or even tertiary fusion component depending on what you're trying to summon, which is going to be an inconsistent 3-card combo no matter how you slice it. And while Proto-Cyber Dragon did technically help make this more viable, it was utterly outclassed and made redundant by cards that could better cheat out Cyber Dragon fusions. Because if you could bring out these bosses with just a single Cyberstein or a copy of Future Fusion, why would you ever go through the trouble of trying to hard summon them with your prototype? In order to be useful for Machine or Cyber Dragon decks, Proto-Cyber Dragon needed something else going for it. An extra effect that gave it some real value or made it more of a unique inclusion. Because without it, if there's an even easier way to bring out these monsters, of which there are plenty, players are always going to default to those options without even considering Proto-Cyber Dragon. Now, usually, after analyzing a mechanic's most prominent failures, it's a good idea to take a step back and try to see areas where the mechanic has found success, or if a particular deck or strategy has managed to flesh out the idea more into a more viable concept. But the really cool thing about this particular topic is that because of how old it is, we can actually look at the very same archetypes and cards to see how name changing has managed to evolve over the years into a successful mechanic. Take the Archefiend cards, where we concluded on our discussion of them earlier, it was plain to see that the failure of their name changing stemmed from the fact that these cards couldn't properly communicate their newfound classifications. Thankfully though, a really eloquent solution was introduced back in Absolute Power Force, the archetype condition. This initially wasn't introduced for Archefiend specifically, it was actually for the Phantom Beast archetype so that Chimera could be officially labeled as part of the Phantom Beast with just a simple line of text. And that's that. There was no need for you to go to a website or ask someone who might have some tentative knowledge, since now the information you needed was almost unavoidable. It would take a couple of years for the Archefiend cards to follow suit, but in 2013 we got to see them reprinted with a similar line of text, including the likes of Summoned Skull, which meant that for the very first time, a normal monster had text that had genuine influence on gameplay. This was an almost perfect solution to the initial mistranslation of some older Archefiends, because on every print going forward, there was a specific signal that ensured there was no ambiguity as to what was and wasn't an archefiend. Likewise, the solution to the issues that the Harpie Lady cards presented was also incredibly simple, but extremely elegant, and solved even earlier than the archefiend problem with the release of Harpie Queen. Because instead of having a condition that permanently alters its name for all purposes, Harpie Queen had an effect that only changed its name while on the field or in the graveyard. This was important as it meant that you could play Harpie Queen alongside the original Harpie Lady without having to cut down on either. And all the while, Harpie Queen can still be used to synergize with the deck's awkwardly worded foundations, albeit with some caveats. You see, because Harpie Queen wasn't a Harpie Lady in deck, you couldn't use an elegant egotist to bring her to the field. But in all honesty, that didn't matter much. If anything, this small weakness made the card an even more effective piece of support, as it meant that you were still incentivized to run a Harpie Lady alongside her to reap the benefits of your archetypal emergency teleport. And the best part is that Queen's strength isn't just limited to its name-changing capability. It also comes with a great upgrade in stats from the original Harpie Lady, and even searches for Harpie's Hunting Ground if you're willing to discard it, which was a huge boon for the strategy at the time, as Hunting Ground is an amazing way of forcing out your opponent's back row. Now, Harpie Queen wasn't the first card that changed its name with an effect to be printed. That honor goes to Proto-Cyber. But the way Queen was designed, where its name change was a bonus attached to an already great effect, laid down the blueprints for what would become the most common style of cards that changed their name. We got to see Queen's direct influence in 2014 when Harpie Lady entered the meta contention with the likes of Channeler and Perfumer, both having great individual effects, all while having the same name-changing bonus as Harpie Queen, netting them the same benefits she afforded back in 2007. But on a wider level, you can see Harpie Queen's design influence on a ton of different strategies that involve name-altering effects, as by giving these cards good effects independent of their name-changing, it guaranteed that they'd see play regardless, which allowed for their name-altering effect to be useful without forcing you to go out of your way to summon a monster that was virtually a vanilla. And that's where a card like Proto-Cyber ultimately failed, because while its name change was useful, it wasn't useful enough. Which is why, despite Proto-Cyber being the prototype for Cyber support, modern Cyber support actually looks a lot more like Harpie Queen than they do Proto-Cyber, as all of these cards are excellent in their own right, while also treating themselves as Cyber as a wonderful bonus that makes them perfect fusion fodder for when you need them to be, but can still function independently of that. It's a shame the same improvement can't be found in the next cards though, but sometimes the same name condition can actually be used to further a deck's uniqueness rather than solely being a debuff, and Umi strategies happen to display this astonishingly well. There are 5 field spells in the game that will always treat themselves as Umi, which means that it's virtually impossible to devise a consistent strategy trying to use all of them at once, which sounds similar to the Harpie conundrum. But that restriction isn't a problem at all, because each of these field spells were made to be entirely unique from one another despite them sharing a name, as they rely on completely different playstyles that would otherwise just clash. Forcing a legendary ocean into a synchro strategy sounds like a bad idea when you need the right levels, and Pacifist would struggle to work with any kind of effect monster in play. However, they still reap the benefits of being called Umi, since while these cards promote entirely unique strategies, there's a strong pool of cards they can all dip into by virtue of their name, with Sea Stealth Attack in particular being a great option that makes your back row and water monsters astonishingly difficult to out. So, with all of that being said, would it be fair to say that early implementation of name changers was a failure? Surprisingly, the answer is yes. These early name alterations each had their own intended goal that they struggled to achieve. The Archefiend's condition wasn't well communicated on the cards themselves. The original Harpie Ladies logging out of playing the originals seems like a shockingly bad design flaw, and a lot of the game's original name changers lacked any kind of real power behind their name changing effects. But more than anything, these mistakes were clearly born out of experimentation, seeing what worked and what didn't in an effort to figure out how to properly implement the mechanic. And once they found something that made sense, they ran with it. And now, in the modern era, cards that change their name are abundant and successful enough to keep being featured, and not just in one way either. We've talked about name changers and effects and conditions, but we haven't even touched on cards that change their name for a fusion or synchro summon, cards that are given text to remove them from an archetype, and even cards that will alter the name by effect while they're still in the deck, which allows them the ability to be searched and summoned from the deck as if they were the original card, without the cruelty of a condition of actually being it. So, as a whole, while the beginnings of name changers might have been a bit rocky, the mechanic as a whole is a shining success, and one that's been interpreted and reinterpreted in a vast array of different ways since its origins, to the point where it barely even registers as being a quirk of a card or an archetype anymore, as these name changers will often work exactly as intended, functioning perfectly. Alright, and that's the video. If you can think of any other important name changers, or know of any other cards or mechanics that failed, please let us know down in the comments below.